Well, the New York Times has released an interesting series of articles titled "I Was Wrong About." Within the opinion collections, journalists write about subjects they were wrong about over the years, including inflation, capitalism, protests, Facebook, Chinese censorship, Mitt Romney, and of particular interest, Trump voters. Bret Stephens wrote the article titled "I Was Wrong About Trump Voters." Within it, he denounces his own covering of conservative voters from way back in 2015 when Donald Trump announced his run for US president. It begins with, "The worst line I ever wrote as a pundit, yes, I know it's a crowded field, was the first line I ever wrote about the man who would become the 45th president. If by now you don't find Donald Trump appalling, you're appalling." Mr. Stephens writes that he has no regrets in what he wrote about the presidential candidate, but he does regret his broad swipe at his voters. It also probably did more to help than hinder Trump's candidacy. Telling voters they are moral ignoramuses is a bad way of getting them to change their minds. It continues, "When I looked at Trump, I saw a bigoted blowhard making one ignorant argument after another. When Trump supporters saw was a candidate whose entire being was a proudly raised middle finger at a self-satisfied elite that had produced a failing status quo." That was the thing about Donald Trump. He managed to speak to the hearts of Americans who felt neglected by the Democrat Party, who felt like their priorities weren't heard. When the presidential candidate campaigned through small towns in red states, he got their attention. And this is something that Bret Stephens acknowledges. "I was blind to this, though I had spent the years of Barack Obama's presidency denouncing his policies. My objections were more abstract than personal. I belonged to a social class that my friend Peggy Noonan called the protected. My family lived in a safe and pleasant neighbourhood. Our kids went to an excellent public school. I was well paid, fully insured, insulated against life's harsh edges." Trump's appeal, according to Noonan, was largely to people she called the unprotected. Their neighbourhoods weren't so safe and pleasant. Their schools weren't so excellent. Their livelihoods weren't so secure. Their experience of America was often one of a cultural and economic decline, sometimes felt in the most personal of ways. He goes on to acknowledge that Trump voters were angered by three things that they had the right to be angry about: 9/11, the financial crisis of 2008, and the post-crisis recovery of that. The Times reporter also points out that the social issues of the American Cultural Revolution became a base of politics and eventually moral bullying. And then he hits a nerve with one of the most scandalous things to happen in the US political system, the Russia collusion hoax. The false claims that Donald Trump was colluding with Russia in order to influence the 2016 federal election was a fall from grace by the mainstream media. He writes about Republican voters saying, "Nor were they impressed by Trump critics who had their own penchant for hypocrisy and outright slander. To this day, precious few anti-Trumpers have been honest with themselves about the elaborate hoax. There's just no other word for it. That was the Steele dossier and all the bogus allegations credulously parroted in the mainstream media that flowed from it." Donald Trump is still yet to announce whether he plans to run for a third consecutive campaign, but there is speculation that he will make the call before the November midterm elections.